There are some moments in Genoa City when a secret no longer behaves like buried history and begins to breathe like a living threat, slipping through locked doors, listening from corners, waiting for the exact instant fear becomes action. This is one of those moments, and for Phyllis, it begins with a realization so sharp and so terrifying that it does not merely unsettle her, it reorganizes every instinct she has. The danger is no longer distant, no longer hypothetical, no longer something she can manage with deflection, charm, misdirection, or one more strategic lie. The danger has a face now, and that face belongs to Tessa. Quiet, watchful, far more perceptive than people often give her credit for, Tessa becomes the one person standing too close to a truth powerful enough to destroy whatever remains of the fragile image Phyllis has fought to preserve. The kind of truth that does not simply embarrass or complicate, but detonates reputation, loyalty, and the carefully negotiated tolerance others have extended to Phyllis after years of chaos. Once Phyllis understands that Tessa knows, really knows, and may be preparing to expose it, panic stops being an emotion and becomes a strategy, then a reflex, and finally a weapon she can no longer control. What makes the situation especially dangerous is that Tessa does not behave like someone seeking drama for its own sake. She is not reckless in the obvious way, not interested in spectacle, not motivated by the shallow thrill of gossip. That restraint is precisely what frightens Phyllis most. A loud enemy can be anticipated. A thoughtful one is far more threatening. Tessa's silence carries intent. Her caution suggests evidence. The fact that she does not rush into public accusation tells Phyllis that this is not rumor or misunderstanding, but something weightier, something Tessa has likely verified enough to trust her own judgment. And once Phyllis sees those signs, she begins to spiral. Not outwardly at first. Outwardly, she remains what she has always trained herself to be in crisis. Quick-minded, dismissive, guarded, sarcastic when necessary, emotionally slippery enough to avoid direct capture. But beneath that performance, something far more primitive takes hold. It is the knowledge that exposure, once placed in Tessa's hands, is no longer governed by Phyllis's timing. That loss of control is what shatters her equilibrium. For Phyllis, the threat is never only about punishment. It is about losing the ability to shape the story before the story shapes her. At the same time, Tessa is carrying her own burden of conflict, because knowing a destructive truth is not the same as knowing what to do with it. She understands the potential fallout. She understands that exposing Phyllis will not occur in a vacuum. There will be collateral damage, emotional aftershocks, family fractures, and the inevitable moral ambiguity that comes from tearing open a secret that may implicate more people than expected. Tessa is not blind to suffering, which is why she moves quietly, carefully assembling what she knows, testing whether silence has become complicity. That internal hesitation makes her more human and also more tragic, because it means she does not walk into danger believing herself invincible. She walks into it aware that truth has consequences, and still deciding that some consequences may be necessary. In another life, that might have allowed for a conversation, for measured confrontation, for some narrow path through the crisis that did not lead to violence. But that possibility depends on Phyllis being emotionally capable of restraint, and by the time the collision comes, she is no longer operating from judgment. She is operating from terror. The confrontation happens under the weight of everything Phyllis refuses to lose. Her reputation may already be scarred, but scarred is not destroyed, and she has always lived on the narrow strip between public disgrace and personal reinvention. She knows how people see her, what they forgive, what they merely tolerate, and what would finally push them beyond return. The secret Tessa holds, whatever its exact shape, belongs in that final category. It threatens not just image, but permanence. It could strip away the last defenses Phyllis has built around herself and force others to see not a flawed survivor, not a messy mother, not an impulsive woman with a talent for self-sabotage, but someone capable of a more devastating kind of moral collapse. That is why when she intercepts Tessa before the truth can go public, the atmosphere between them is already electric with desperation. This is not a dispute between two women who dislike each other. It is a collision between one woman who believes truth must come into the light and another who feels that light as annihilation. There is no peace in Phyllis when she stops Tessa. Even before a wordless accusation passes between them, the emotional shape of the scene is clear. Tessa is no longer merely a witness. She is an existential threat. And Tessa, seeing the intensity in Phyllis, likely understands at once that this is no longer a conversation about persuasion. It is about survival, moral, and perhaps physical. Phyllis tries at first to regain the upper hand the only way she knows. Intimidation, emotional pressure, the implication that Tessa does not fully understand what she is about to unleash, the suggestion that exposing the truth will hurt innocent people too. Each tactic contains a fragment of reality, and that is part of what makes Phyllis so dangerous. She rarely lies in a pure form. She twists genuine consequences into shields for her own self-protection. She tries to make Tessa doubt whether disclosure is worth the destruction it will cause. She tries to cast herself as cornered rather than guilty, desperate rather than malicious, wounded rather than dangerous. But Tessa does not fully retreat, and that refusal is the point at which fear in Phyllis mutates into something more volatile. The loss of control is instant, and yet prepared by years of emotional instability Phyllis has never truly mastered. One wrong look, one refusal too many, one sign that Tessa will not back down, and Phyllis crosses the line she likely told herself she would never cross. She lashes out, not with the cold calculation of a planned attack, but with the blind force of someone whose panic has overwhelmed every moral boundary she once relied on to separate herself from the very worst version of who she could become. That distinction matters, but only tragically, because while the assault may not be premeditated in a technical sense, it is still born from a lifetime of choosing control over surrender, reaction over accountability, fear over truth. In that instant, Tessa is no longer a person in Phyllis's mind. She becomes the mouth that must be silenced, the hand that must be stopped, the threat that must be neutralized before the future collapses. It is a horrifying reduction, and it is one Phyllis will have to live with long after the moment passes, if she is capable of facing it at all. The physical struggle is messy in the most painful way, because nothing about it resembles power or precision. It is chaos. Two people locked inside a terrible miscalculation, one trying to hold on to truth, the other trying to bury it beneath sheer force. Tessa fights back not because she wants to win, but because instinct demands survival. That instinct, combined with Phyllis's frantic aggression, turns the confrontation into something escalating and unstable. The violence takes on a terrifying momentum of its own. Hands shove, bodies collide, balance is lost, panic compounds panic, and in one brutal sequence, the situation slips beyond either woman's control. This is the nightmare hidden inside every act of desperation. The point at which intention ceases to matter, because the damage has become real. Tessa is seriously hurt, and once that happens, nothing Phyllis tells herself can reverse it. The confrontation is no longer about keeping a secret. It has become a catastrophe with blood, consequences, and the irreversible weight of physical harm. The sight of Tessa injured is the first moment the fog begins to crack for Phyllis. But clarity does not bring immediate nobility. It brings horror. She sees what she has done and cannot process it cleanly because doing so would require admitting that her fear was powerful enough to turn her violent. For a brief and terrible stretch of time, the world around her must feel unreal, as if the scene has detached from ordinary life and entered some isolated chamber where morality has been suspended. Tessa's condition is serious. Her body bears the evidence of a confrontation that was never supposed to go this far, and that fact becomes the new center of gravity. Whatever secret Phyllis hoped to contain is now fused to something even darker, an act that may expose not only her hidden truth but the terrifying lengths she was willing to go to protect it. In one swing of fate, the original danger multiplies. The cover-up instinct that drove her to attack may now make the final exposure even more ruinous than the truth Tessa was carrying. This is where the psychological tragedy of Phyllis becomes especially brutal. She is not a simple villain gleefully choosing harm. She is a woman whose fear of collapse has finally produced the collapse itself. Yet that does not soften the danger she represents. If anything, it makes her more unstable, because people who cross a line in panic are often capable of crossing another in order to survive the first. The moment after violence is often more morally decisive than the violence itself. Does she call for help immediately? Does she try to manipulate the scene? Does she tell herself that if Tessa stays silent, everything can still be salvaged? These are the kinds of questions that define whether panic becomes remorse or hardens into full corruption. And because this is Phyllis, because survival has so often mattered to her more than moral cleanliness, the answer cannot be simple. Her mind likely fractures into competing impulses all at once: guilt, terror, self-preservation, maternal fear, public shame, the need to flee, the need to fix, the need to erase. That storm inside her is almost as dangerous as the attack itself, because it determines what kind of woman emerges from the ruins of the moment. Tessa, meanwhile, becomes the emotional center of a widening disaster. Her injuries place her in danger, but the danger is not only medical. If she survives, and if she regains the strength to speak fully, then the truth she carried may now gain even greater power because it will be linked to an act of violence. What might once have been dismissed by some as scandal or accusation can now no longer be separated from the fact that Phyllis fought to stop it with physical force. That changes perception. It gives moral shape to suspicion. People who may have doubted Tessa's information before will now question why Phyllis reacted with such ferocity. In that sense, the attack fails in the most ironic and devastating way possible. Instead of silencing danger, it confirms it. Instead of protecting Phyllis's name, it brands her fear across the entire situation. Instead of buying time, it accelerates collapse. The ripple effect through those connected to Tessa would be immediate and emotionally explosive. Mariah, already shaped by her own long history of trauma, abandonment, and hard-won trust, would not see this as an isolated crime. She would experience it as a profound violation, not only of Tessa's safety, but of the fragile life they built through honesty, pain, and endurance. The idea that Phyllis, a woman already associated with turmoil and emotional destruction, could become the direct cause of Tessa's physical suffering would ignite something primal in Mariah. Not simply anger, but protective fury sharpened by fear. That kind of fury is dangerous because it does not seek balance, it seeks consequence. Mariah would not care about Phyllis's excuses, her panic, or her emotional unraveling. All of that would sound like selfish noise beside the sight of Tessa in a hospital bed or some equally grave state of recovery. To Mariah, the matter would become simple in the way trauma sometimes simplifies complex moral situations. Someone she loves was hurt because another person chose violence over truth. From that point forward, every soft edge around Phyllis disappears. And yet the emotional landscape remains complicated because Genoa City is built on tangled loyalties, shared histories, and old wounds that refuse to die cleanly. Others will inevitably begin asking what secret Tessa knew, why it threatened Phyllis so profoundly, and who else may have been indirectly linked to it. The mystery that began as personal now becomes communal, and that transformation places even more pressure on everyone involved. Because a dangerous secret almost never belongs to one person alone. Secrets of this magnitude tend to have roots, beneficiaries, protectors, and silent witnesses. Once Tessa's injury draws public attention, the need to understand motive becomes urgent. Motive leads to history. History leads to names. And every step in that chain drags Phyllis deeper into a web she can no longer control by sheer will. What makes Phyllis's downward spiral so compelling is the contradiction at its core. She may genuinely believe that she is trying to protect something essential, something whose exposure would destroy more than just her. She may even persuade herself that Tessa did not understand the scale of the fallout she was about to unleash. But these rationalizations cannot erase the central truth that matters most. When confronted with accountability, Phyllis chose force. That choice reveals something devastating about her internal architecture. Beneath all the charisma, the improvisation, the pain, the fierce declarations of love and self-defense, there remains a fatal inability to surrender control when the truth becomes unbearable. She has spent years surviving consequences by moving faster than them, but violence is what happens when speed fails and terror takes over. In that sense, the attack on Tessa is not separate from her character history. It is the ugliest culmination of it. The aftermath is where the true punishment begins. Because even before law, public outrage, or personal retaliation arrive, Phyllis is trapped with the knowledge of what she has done. That internal imprisonment should not be romanticized, but it matters. A person can spend years justifying lies and manipulation because the harm feels abstract, delayed, or emotionally negotiable. Physical injury is different. It refuses abstraction. Tessa's suffering would force a reckoning not only with guilt but with identity. Phyllis would have to confront whether this act was an aberration born from one unbearable moment or whether it exposed a darkness in her that has always been waiting beneath the surface of her self-mythology. That is a terrifying question, because if the answer is the latter, then her greatest battle is no longer with enemies, accusers, or scandal. It is with herself. Still, people like Phyllis rarely move cleanly toward repentance. The road is usually crooked, obstructed by self-pity, defensive blame, and the instinct to frame themselves as victims of circumstance. She may initially tell herself that Tessa forced the confrontation, that she only meant to stop her, that things spiraled too fast, that panic overtook intention. Some of that may even be true in fragments. But fragments do not absolve a pattern, and what the world will see is the whole shape of the event. Tessa knew a dangerous truth. Phyllis confronted her, violence followed, and Tessa ended up gravely injured. In matters like this, narrative matters almost as much as evidence, and the narrative here is brutal. It paints Phyllis not as misunderstood, but as cornered and therefore catastrophic. It suggests that underneath her fear lies the capacity to destroy whoever threatens her. That image, once fixed in the minds of others, becomes nearly impossible to erase. For Tessa, survival would mean more than healing physically. It would mean deciding whether to continue what she began. Trauma changes the relationship between truth and courage. Some people are strengthened by surviving an attack and become even more determined to expose what was nearly buried. Others are shaken into silence, not because they no longer believe in the truth, but because the body remembers what honesty cost. That emotional question would give the story even more depth. If Tessa wakes carrying not only pain, but the knowledge that someone tried to stop her at any price, then her next step becomes profoundly significant. Does she speak immediately, driven by moral resolve and righteous anger? Does she hesitate, terrified that further exposure will provoke even more destruction? Either path is understandable, either path is tragic, and both reveal how violence distorts not only bodies but choices. Mariah's role in that aftermath would likely become one of relentless pressure. She would demand answers from investigators, from family, from anyone who knew more than they admitted. She would not simply want Phyllis punished. She would want the hidden truth unearthed completely, because now secrecy itself would feel like part of the assault. Every person urging patience or caution would risk sounding complicit. That intensity could create new fractures across multiple families, especially if older alliances or buried sympathies begin to resurface. In a city where people often protect their own even when they should not, Mariah's demand for uncompromising clarity would become both morally powerful and emotionally explosive. She would force others to choose sides, and those choices would expose how much Genoa City still tolerates from damaged people as long as the damage stays conveniently private. And that may be the cruelest theme running through everything, the illusion that private damage stays private. Phyllis may have believed that her secret was hers to manage, hers to frame, hers to conceal until the timing suited her. But secrets of this kind are never truly contained. They leak into relationships, distort trust, shape instinct, and eventually demand enforcement. By the time violence erupts, the secret has already been alive for far too long. Tessa merely becomes the mirror Phyllis cannot bear to look into. And instead of facing the reflection, Phyllis tries to break it. That is what makes the confrontation so haunting. It is not only a crime of panic, it is a symbolic act of self-destruction. In attacking Tessa, Phyllis attacks the possibility of truth itself, and in doing so, she ensures that the truth will come back with even greater force. The public fallout would be merciless. Phyllis has always been a deeply polarizing figure, but polarization depends on ambiguity. People defend her because they can still argue that beneath the chaos, she is redeemable, that beneath the selfishness she feels deeply, that beneath the manipulation, there is some core of human pain they recognize. A violent assault on Tessa narrows that ambiguity dramatically. It turns sympathy into liability. It forces even former defenders to ask whether they misread her for years. And that social isolation would intensify her psychological collapse, because Phyllis does not endure abandonment well. She reacts to it. Sometimes by pleading, sometimes by raging, sometimes by making everything worse. The loss of public standing would not humble her immediately. It would probably make her more unstable first, more likely to lash out at anyone she feels has judged her too quickly while ignoring the pressures that drove her over the edge. But outrage at being condemned cannot coexist forever with the evidence of what she has done. Eventually, reality presses in, and when it does, it tends to arrive with unbearable weight. What began as a secret dangerous enough to ruin a reputation has now metastasized into something far more serious. A moral collapse with a body at the center of it. Tessa's injury transforms the story from scandal to emergency, from revelation to crime, from personal reckoning to public crisis. Every character drawn into the fallout must now wrestle with a question larger than the secret itself. What do you do when the fear of truth turns someone into the very thing they spent years insisting they were not? That is the question facing anyone who ever defended Phyllis, loved her, underestimated her, or believed her capacity for damage had limits. The answer will not come easily, because Phyllis is not monstrous in a cartoon sense. She is something more disturbing, recognizably human in her fear, and therefore more horrifying in the extremity of what that fear produces. By the end of it, no one remains untouched. Tessa is left fighting through pain and danger because she came too close to the truth. Mariah is forced into a war fueled by love and rage. The larger community is dragged into another reckoning with the cost of enabling instability for too long. And Phyllis stands at the center of the devastation, not as a misunderstood rebel this time, not as a survivor making messy choices, but as a woman whose terror of exposure drove her into an act she may never be able to morally outlive. That is what makes the story so dark and so compelling. The real tragedy is not only that a secret existed, it is that when the secret was finally threatened, Phyllis chose violence over surrender, and in that choice, she revealed a truth far more destructive than the one Tessa was preparing to share. She revealed that the deepest danger was never the information alone. It was the panic of the person who could not bear to let it breathe.